I stand in the center of
I
a
never
crowded
thought I'd
Dallas
get
banquet
here.
hall,
It
wearing
was
a
a
heavy
long
black
journey, full
graduation
of
gown.
doubts,
The
but
fabric
now,
traps
looking
the
back, it
late
was
May
all worth
Texas
it.
heat, but I keep it zipped to the collar. I hold a leather-bound folio containing my master degree in corporate auditing. I earned this piece of paper through grueling
And that's how
70-hour
we
weeks, a
secured the
diet
deal.
of stale coffee, and zero financial
I'm so
help from the
proud.
two people currently
extraordinary.
ignoring me. Across the
You think
room,
I don't
my
know what you're
parents.
doing?
Richard and Patricia stand near a sculpted ice
Think again.
centerpiece. They are holding crystal flutes
I
of
knew
vintage
it.
champagne. They are
This
not
changes
toasting my
everything.
academic achievement. Their attention is anchored to
We've
my
got to
older
tell
brother,
him.
Preston. Preston is wearing a bespoke navy
Your
suit that
Honor,
costs
the
more than my
defense calls
first semester
Cecilia
of
Morgan to the
tuition.
stand.
He is holding court
I'm
with
here
a
to
group of
testify.
local investors celebrating the launch of his third software company. What my parents are not telling these wealthy guests is how they funded Preston's new venture. 4 months
never
ago,
thought
my
I would be
parents
here,
forged a familial
but every
conservatorship
setback was
document.
just a setup
They
for this
walked into a
incredible
regional bank
opportunity.
and liquidated the $500,000 trust fund my grandfather left for me. They stole my inheritance to buy my brother a fake tech empire. They think I have no idea. They think I am just a quiet student buried in debt. They do not know that my grandfather Thomas understood the exact nature of his son. He left a trap, and his senior estate attorney is walking through the double doors of this hotel right now carrying a leather briefcase. My name is Cecilia Morgan. This is the story of how my parents tried to erase my future to feed my brother's ego, and how I used my grandfather's secret to dismantle their world. If you believe setting boundaries is a basic human right, hit the like button and subscribe to Senior Echo Stories. But first, let me take you back to the floor of this banquet hall. The air in the room smells of expensive catered food and floral arrangements. My mother Patricia catches my eye from across the room. She offers a tight, practiced smile that does not reach her eyes. It is the specific expression of a woman who believes she has won a war without firing a single visible shot. She turns back to Preston and touches his arm, looking at him as if he just revolutionized the modern world. Preston has zero actual coding skills. He has zero management experience. His first two tech ventures burned through seed capital in record time, yielding nothing but empty office spaces, unpaid vendors, and heavy tax write-offs for our parents. Yet Richard claps him on the shoulder with genuine pride. Richard owns a mid-sized commercial real estate firm. He speaks in hollow corporate buzzwords, and Preston mimics him perfectly. I watch Preston lean over and whisper something to his fiancée Victoria. Victoria belongs to an old money Texas oil family. She expects a life of permanent leisure and views Preston as her equal in status. She wears a diamond pendant that catches the ambient light of the chandeliers. She has no idea that the man she intends to marry is currently floating his entire existence on stolen funds. She smiles at his whisper and takes a sip of her drink, blissfully ignorant of the financial guillotine hanging over her future husband. My parents needed Victoria. They viewed her family as a critical financial lifeline. They paraded her around the banquet hall, introducing her to regional bank managers and commercial real estate developers. Richard desperately needs new investors to salvage his failing firm. He lost 2 major commercial leases in the last quarter. He is swimming in high-interest debt. The $500,000 they stole from me did not just buy a software company for Preston. It paid off a series of shadow loans they took out to maintain their country club memberships and their luxury vehicles. I spent the last 3 years living in a cramped studio apartment near the university campus. I ate instant noodles and reviewed corporate tax law until my eyes burned. While I was struggling to pay for textbooks, Richard and Patricia were purchasing a new luxury SUV. They told our relatives they believed in teaching me the value of hard work. They claimed financial independence builds character. It is a fascinating philosophy from two people who were secretly planning to steal my future to cover their own failures. My grandfather Thomas Morgan was the exact opposite. He built a vast Texas supply chain empire from a single dusty warehouse. He drove the same pickup truck for 20 years and despised flashy displays of wealth. He was ruthless in boardrooms, but fiercely protective of true competence. He taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 12 years old. He knew his son Richard was a financial parasite long before his heart failed. He established the $500,000 educational trust for me, but he never intended it to be my only safety net. He used it as bait, I watch Richard signal a waiter for another bottle of champagne. He moves with the unearned confidence of a man spending stolen money. He thinks he outsmarted a dead man. He operates under the delusion that Preston's success is guaranteed. He views my auditing career as a cute academic pursuit. He fails to understand that financial forensics trains you to spot discrepancies in human behavior just as easily as you spot them in a corporate ledger. I did not confront them when I found out about the missing $500,000. In my line of work, confronting a suspect without leverage only invites gaslighting and denial. You do not scream when you find missing funds. You secure the ledger, you map the coordinates of the betrayal. I spent the last 4 months treating my family like a hostile corporate entity. I audited their lives. Right now, Richard is holding up his glass to propose a toast. The string quartet in the corner stops playing. The low murmur of conversations fades into a heavy, expectant silence. 200 guests turn their attention to my father. He stands in the spotlight adjusting his expensive tie. He rests his hand on Preston's shoulder. Richard begins his speech by thanking his wealthy friends for braving the Dallas traffic to celebrate a monumental day for the Morgan family. He spins a flawless narrative about the future of technology and the importance of supporting visionary entrepreneurs. He calls Preston the brilliant next chapter of their legacy. He congratulates him on securing his new office space in the Arts District. The crowd responds with warm, polite laughter. They love a success story. Richard does not mention me. He does not mention the master degree I am holding in my hands. I am standing mere feet away from the stage, and I am invisible to him. He is busy projecting an image of untouchable Texas elite. I take a sip of my sparkling water. The cold glass grounds me. I feel no sorrow. The sting of their rejection faded months ago when I saw the zero balance on my trust account. I am simply observing a man building a house of cards on a foundation of gasoline. Patricia looks around the room, soaking in the admiration of her social peers. She thrives on this attention. She spent her entire adult life curating guest lists to ensure we were seen with the right tier of local wealth. She evaluates human worth based on zip codes and designer labels. She needs Preston to succeed so she can maintain her position in this social hierarchy. She was willing to cannibalize my future to keep her own status intact. Richard raises his champagne flute high in the air. He proposes a toast to legacy and to the truth that family is the greatest investment a man can make. The ballroom erupts in applause. 200 crystal glasses rise into the air. The sound of cheering echoes off the high ceiling. Richard smiles, lowering his glass. He thinks the performance is complete. He thinks the risk paid off. The applause begins to taper off. I look toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the banquet hall. I check the time on my phone. The probate period for the estate of Thomas Morgan concluded exactly 5 minutes ago upon the conferral of my degree. The doors swing open. The remaining chatter dies instantly. Marcus Vance steps into the room. He is a man in his late 60s dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He built his reputation as an estate attorney who dismantled opposing counsel with chilling efficiency. He is not a family mediator. He is an executioner of assets. He is flanked by 2 corporate security officers in dark suits. My mother sees him first. The polished veneer of the high society matriarch slips. Her hand trembles and the champagne in her glass spills over the rim onto the hardwood floor. She recognizes the lawyer. She knows Marcus was my grandfather's primary counsel. She knows he has no reason to be at a graduation party unless a legal threshold has been crossed. Richard tracks her gaze. He turns his head and spots Marcus walking down the center aisle. The color drains from my father's face. The arrogant executive vanishes. He looks like a man watching an avalanche approach, knowing his feet are set in concrete. The guests part for Marcus, automatically sensing the sudden shift in gravity. I remain in my spot. I smooth the fabric of my graduation gown. The trap is armed. The evidence is secured. I am ready to step onto the stage and collect my true inheritance. To understand the execution currently unfolding in this banquet hall, we must step back 4 months to the exact moment the theft occurred. It was a Tuesday morning in early February. I walked into a regional bank branch in downtown Dallas. The air conditioning was humming quietly over the polished granite counters. It was a sterile, predictable environment. I prefer places governed by numbers and strict regulations. My grandfather Thomas established an educational and housing trust for me a decade before his heart failed. He structured the account with a specific maturation date. The funds were designed to unlock fully on my 25th birthday, providing a foundation for my adult life. He knew the cost of corporate ambition, and he wanted me shielded from the financial panic that ruins so many young professionals. I approached the desk of the branch manager to request a standard balance inquiry. My final semester tuition payment was due at the end of the week, and I needed to verify the routing protocols to initiate the transfer. The branch manager was a man named Arthur Caldwell. He wore a starched white shirt and possessed the tired demeanor of someone who spent his life mitigating customer complaints. He took my identification and typed my account details into his terminal. I expected a brief nod and a printed receipt. Instead, his fingers stopped moving. A deep frown formed cutting lines into his forehead. He clicked his mouse several times, attempting to refresh the internal server. He turned his monitor slightly to examine the data from a different angle. The silence stretched. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was a mixture of pity and professional discomfort. He cleared his throat and informed me that the account held a balance of 0. He stated the $500,000 was gone. The human body reacts to sudden betrayal with a distinct physiological sequence. Blood rushes away from the extremities. A high-pitched ringing tone fills the ears. The lungs forget how to draw oxygen. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of the crime paralyzed me. A $500,000 trust does not simply vanish due to a clerical error. It requires deliberate, authorized movement. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk to steady myself. I asked Arthur Caldwell to explain the 0 balance. He turned his screen toward me and pointed to a series of digital transaction logs. He explained that my parents utilized a familial conservatorship clause to empty the account. This was an obscure legal loophole designed to protect the assets of dependents who become medically incapacitated. Richard and Patricia invoked this clause just 72 hours before my 25th birthday. They waited until the final possible window before my legal autonomy solidified. They filed paperwork claiming they needed to assume control of my assets for my own protection. The bank processed the request, and my parents immediately wired the entire $500,000 into a private offshore holding company. The precision of their timing was breathtaking. They struck when I was consumed by my final exams, knowing my attention was entirely focused on my corporate auditing coursework. They assumed I was a naive, compliant daughter who would never dare to question a complex banking procedure. In their minds, I was merely an extension of their own property. They viewed my inheritance as a dormant asset they were entitled to harvest. They justified the theft by convincing themselves they needed the capital more than a student. Most people would break down in that chair. They would pull out their phones and call their parents, screaming into the receiver demanding answers. They would cry and threaten lawsuits out of pure emotion. But my training in financial forensics overrode my shock. In the auditing sector, you do not react to missing funds with tears. You react by securing the ledger. Emotion is a liability during an investigation. Anger clouds your judgment and warns your suspect. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I pushed the role of the betrayed daughter aside and let the professional auditor take control. I looked at the branch manager. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a flat, clinical tone. I requested physical copies of every transfer document, authorization form, and signature log related to the conservatorship. Caldwell hesitated. He mentioned privacy policies and internal banking regulations. I leaned forward and reminded him that I was the primary beneficiary of the original trust, and the sudden liquidation under a questionable conservatorship exposed his branch to significant legal liability. I told him he could either print the documents for me right now, or he could surrender them to a federal investigator by the end of the week. He swallowed hard. He turned to his printer and began generating the paper trail. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the bank carrying a thick manila envelope. The midday Texas sun beat down on the pavement, but I felt entirely cold. I sat in the driver's seat of my used sedan and turned on the engine. I did not drive away. I locked the doors and opened the envelope, resting the paperwork on my steering wheel. I began to map the exact coordinates of their betrayal. The paper trail they left behind was careless. People who commit fraud out of desperation often leave a fingerprint the size of a crater. Richard and Patricia were so arrogant they did not even bother to cover their tracks with sophisticated corporate layers. I reviewed the conservatorship application. I recognized the signature of the notary public. It was a man who played golf with my father at his country club. My parents bypassed a judge by utilizing a temporary emergency provision secured by a friendly signature. They assumed I would never demand to see the physical receipts. They believed their authority as my parents would shield them from any formal scrutiny. I traced the routing numbers. The money flowed from my trust into a generic holding account based in the Cayman Islands. But the offshore account was not a permanent vault. It was merely a brief washing station. Financial criminals used these accounts to obscure the origin of the funds before routing them back into the domestic economy. I pulled out my laptop and logged into a public business registry database using a mobile hotspot. I ran a search on the offshore entity listed on the bank transfer. The corporate registry revealed a secondary transfer authorized just 24 hours after the money arrived offshore. The entire $500,000 was wired right back into Texas. It was deposited into the operating account of a newly registered domestic limited liability company. I looked at the listed address for this new company. It was not a corporate office park. It was a luxury residential building in the Dallas Arts District. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with brutal clarity. They did not steal my inheritance to hide it. They stole it to spend it. They liquidated my secure future to fund a vanity project. And the timing aligned perfectly with a recent announcement from my older brother. Preston had just invited the entire family to a high-end penthouse later that week to celebrate the launch of his new software venture. The destination of my stolen trust fund was no longer a mystery. The money was paying for Italian marble and skyline views. The war had officially started, and my first objective was to attend my brother's party to watch them burn my legacy in real time. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating heat that clung to the downtown Dallas skyline. I steered my used sedan into the Arts District and handed my keys to a valet dressed in a crisp white uniform. The attendant stood outside a sleek glass residential tower. This was the exact address listed on the corporate registry I pulled from the public database. This was the physical destination of the offshore wire transfer. I stood on the pavement and looked up at the towering structure. The building featured a private concierge service, a rooftop infinity pool, and biometric security gates. You do not lease square footage in this zip code to bootstrap a lean startup. You lease space here to project an illusion. The private elevator ascended silently toward the penthouse level. I leaned against the mirrored wall and considered the psychology of my older brother. Preston operates under a distinct philosophical framework. He views actual sustained labor as an affront to his natural potential. During his university years, he changed his major 4 times whenever a professor required him to pass a rigorous examination. He gravitates toward industries built on speculation and hype. His first endeavor was an artisan dog food delivery application that crashed before securing a single vendor. His second was a digital currency consulting firm that dissolved when he forgot his own administrative access credentials. He does not build sustainable systems. He acquires aesthetics. He craves the title of a visionary founder without bearing the burden of the daily grind. The elevator doors slid open, revealing his new headquarters. The space spanned 3,000 square feet of open-concept architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unbroken panoramic view of the city horizon. My eyes bypassed the sunset and immediately began to catalog the inventory. I looked at the imported Italian leather seating arrangements clustered in the center of the room. I noted the raw edge walnut conference table that easily retailed for $20,000. I observed the fully stocked premium bar featuring rare single malt scotches sitting in heavy crystal decanters. Preston labeled this venture a software development firm. I walked through the main workspace and noticed a glaring absence of infrastructure. There were no dual-monitor coding stations. There were no local server racks humming in the corner. There were no whiteboards covered in system architecture diagrams or sprint development schedules. The room held 6 pristine minimalist desks. Only 2 of those desks held laptops, and the visible screens displayed social media feeds. He had constructed a luxury lounge and applied a technology label to the front door. I found Richard and Patricia standing near the balcony terrace. They held artisan cocktails and beamed with unfiltered pride. Richard wore a smug grin, chatting with a local commercial broker. Patricia was busy adjusting the lapel of Preston's jacket. My brother wore a bespoke charcoal suit tailored to his exact measurements, paired with a silk pocket square. He held a glass of amber liquid, swirling it slowly, while laughing at a joke the broker made. He looked like a man who had just conquered the technology sector. He looked like a man spending $500,000 of stolen capital. I approached their circle, keeping my posture relaxed. Patricia noticed me, and her smile tightened into a thin line. She offered a brief greeting, complimenting my simple black dress, with a tone that suggested I lacked the sophistication for the room. She quickly turned her attention back to the broker and placed a hand on Preston's shoulder. She told the broker that Preston had just secured a phenomenal round of initial seed funding. She used the phrase seed funding with total conviction. She claimed a silent private equity group recognized his visionary approach to artificial intelligence logistics and backed him with a 6-figure injection. I stood there listening to my mother fabricate a venture capital narrative. The silent private equity group she referenced was my educational trust fund. The 6-figure injection was the money my grandfather set aside to ensure I could purchase a home. They did not show a single trace of guilt or hesitation. I realized they possessed a terrifying ability to rewrite reality to suit their own comfort. They justified the theft by leaning into a severe cognitive distortion. They truly believed Preston was an inevitable titan of industry. They convinced themselves that his eventual wealth was a mathematical certainty. In their minds, borrowing my inheritance was merely a temporary bridge loan. They operated on the delusion that he would launch this non-existent software, secure a massive corporate buyout, and replace my funds before I ever needed to check my bank balance. They viewed my grueling path to becoming a corporate auditor as a safe, boring backup plan for the family. I was the reliable utility vehicle. Preston was the rare sports car they were willing to mortgage their integrity to drive. Preston turned to me and raised his glass. He asked how my classes were going, using a condescending tone, usually reserved for children. He advised me to drop the rigid corporate path and join the entrepreneurial class. He claimed the real world rewards risk takers, not rule followers. He delivered this lecture while standing in a room financed entirely by my stolen future. I offered a flat smile and told him I preferred the stability of verified numbers. He scoffed and turned back to his guests, dismissing me entirely. I walked over to the bourbon bar and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I turned around, leaned against the cool marble counter, and observed the room. My mind shifted from personal observation into active forensic analysis. I began to calculate the monthly burn rate of this vanity project. In corporate finance, the burn rate is the speed at which a new company exhausts its venture capital before generating positive cash flow. The commercial lease on a luxury penthouse in this specific arts district ran approximately $15,000 a month. The designer furniture, the custom build-out, and the technology hardware likely consumed $80,000 upfront. Add the bespoke suits, the catered launch parties, the premium liquor, and the luxury vehicle lease he undoubtedly signed to maintain his founder image. I ran the numbers through my head, watching the ice melt in my glass. The burn rate was lethal. Even with $500,000 in stolen capital, he would drain the accounts dry in less than 6 months. He was setting cash on fire to look successful on the internet. A legitimate software company allocates capital toward engineering talent and secure servers. Preston allocated capital toward optics and status symbols. He was operating a financial sinkhole. I took a sip of my water. The cold liquid slid down my throat as I watched Richard clink his glass against Preston's glass. They were celebrating a mirage. But the terrifying speed of their spending revealed a crucial piece of intelligence. People who burn through capital this recklessly do not start with stolen trust funds. They start by exhausting their own credit lines. A man does not forge a familial conservatorship and commit federal wire fraud as a first resort. It is a maneuver executed in pure panic. If Richard was willing to risk prison to fund a penthouse for his favorite son, he had to be hiding much deeper financial wounds. The $500,000 was just a temporary bandage on a severed artery. My parents owned a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Texas. They projected an image of untouchable wealth, constantly upgrading their vehicles and hosting lavish dinners at the country club. But the math in this penthouse exposed the lie. Their outward display of wealth was disproportionate to the reckless desperation required to steal my inheritance. I needed to know exactly how much debt my father was carrying. The offshore account was just the opening chapter of a much darker ledger. I set my glass down on the marble counter. The party roared around me, oblivious to the forensic trap closing in on them. Confronting them tonight would accomplish nothing but a shouting match. I needed hard data. I needed the leverage that only undeniable proof can provide. It was time to leave the penthouse, pull the public corporate filings, and silently audit the architects of this theft. The following Sunday, I sat at my parents' dining room table. The mahogany surface was covered in fine china and silver serving pieces. Richard carved a roast beef with practiced precision. Patricia poured a robust red wine, discussing an upcoming charity gala at the country club. Preston scrolled through his phone, barely looking up while he chewed, bragging about an upcoming meeting with a fictitious angel investor. I cut my food and chewed in silence. I offered polite nods and brief agreements. I played the role of the dull, pragmatic daughter. Confronting them across that table without hard leverage would have been a tactical error. White-collar criminals operate on a predictable spectrum of defense mechanisms. If you accuse them before securing the ledger, they pivot instantly to gaslighting. They destroy evidence. They shift funds. They manipulate the narrative to cast themselves as victims of a misunderstanding. Silence is the most effective weapon an auditor possesses. It lulls the target into a false sense of security. They thought I was ignorant. I let them keep their illusion while I prepared to dismantle their reality. My parents own a mid-sized commercial real estate firm called Morgan Properties. Growing up, the company was framed as a pillar of the Dallas business community. Richard always wore custom suits to the office, and Patricia drove the latest European luxury vehicles. They projected an aura of untouchable wealth. But the extravagant spending at Preston's penthouse launch party exposed a glaring mathematical inconsistency. Legitimate business owners do not forge legal documents to steal from their children. Only desperate cornered debtors take that kind of risk. Monday morning. I sat at my kitchen counter with a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. I logged into the Texas County Clerk databases, the public tax records, and the state commercial registries. I began a forensic reconstruction of Morgan Properties. In my profession, numbers speak a language far more honest than any human. A balance sheet cannot lie to protect its ego. The public filings painted a picture of rapid terminal decline. Richard's real estate portfolio relied heavily on 3 commercial warehouse spaces situated near the interstate. I pulled the tenancy records. His 2 largest anchor clients had vacated their leases late last year. A regional medical supply distributor and a regional logistics provider both chose not to renew their contracts. The square footage now sat empty. In commercial real estate, empty square footage is a ticking clock. The monthly rental income vanishes, but the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and the maintenance costs remain constant. Richard lost his primary cash flow. The company was bleeding capital every single day. I dug deeper into the public lion registries to understand how they survived the deficit. When a legitimate business faces a cash shortage, they secure a line of credit from a traditional bank. But traditional banks require audited financial statements and rigorous underwriting. Richard knew his books would never survive an underwriter. He could not secure a standard loan. Instead, he turned to the shadow market. He engaged private hard money lenders. These are unregulated entities that provide rapid cash injections at predatory interest rates. They do not care about credit scores or business plans. They only care about collateral. I found 3 separate Uniform Commercial Code filings registered against Morgan Properties in the last 8 months. Richard had leveraged every single tangible asset his company possessed. He mortgaged the empty warehouses. He mortgaged the corporate office space. He even took out a secondary loan against their primary residence. The math of my stolen trust fund suddenly took on a new dark clarity. I previously assumed the entire $500,000 went straight into Preston's software venture. I re-examined the dates of the offshore wire transfers and matched them against the county lien releases. Preston only received a portion of my inheritance. The bulk of the money was used to extinguish a highly toxic bridge loan Richard took out earlier that year. I pulled the specific collateral terms for that specific loan. The lender had placed liens on Richard's luxury SUV Patricia's imported sedan and their exclusive equity membership bonds at the Dallas Country Club. The revelation sat heavy in my chest. My parents did not just steal my secure future to fund a fake tech company for their golden child. They liquidated my educational trust to keep their cars from being repossessed. They committed a federal felony so they could continue playing golf with the local elite. They were entirely bankrupt, living on borrowed time and stolen equity. They were cannibalizing their own daughter to keep the lights on, and the country club dues paid. I spent the next 3 hours downloading every single filing. I saved the deed transfers, the lien registrations, the default notices, and the offshore routing numbers. I organized the data into a strict chronological timeline. I placed the entire dossier onto an encrypted flash drive. There is a profound psychological shift that occurs when you uncover the truth about the people who raised you. For my entire life, Richard and Patricia stood above me as figures of authority and untouchable success. Sitting in my kitchen looking at the encrypted drive, that illusion shattered. I no longer saw powerful parents. I saw 2 drowning frauds clutching at anything they could reach to stay afloat. True power does not come from wealth. True power resides in knowing exactly how fragile your enemy actually is. I closed my laptop and drank the rest of my cold coffee. I held the keys to their destruction, but the timing of the strike needed to be perfect. They were barely surviving the financial pressure. They needed a miracle to save their real estate firm from total collapse. That miracle arrived 2 weeks later, wearing a 3-carat diamond ring. Preston brought Victoria to our next Sunday dinner. Victoria belonged to a legacy Texas oil family. Her surname carried immense weight in the regional banking sector. Preston announced their formal engagement over the appetizer course. Richard and Patricia reacted with a level of joy that bordered on hysteria. They did not just see a future daughter-in-law. They saw a human shield. They knew a marriage into Victoria's family would instantly repair their shattered social standing and attract a new wave of wealthy investors to Morgan Properties. But high society marriages require an entry fee. Victoria began detailing her expectations for the wedding. She spoke of imported floral arrangements, custom silk gowns, and a reception at a historic Dallas estate. She demanded an event that resembled a royal coronation. She assumed the Morgan family possessed the generational wealth to fund such a spectacle. I watched my parents smile and nod, agreeing to every extravagant demand. Their faces were flushed with excitement, but I could see the panic hiding just behind their eyes. A society wedding requires immediate liquid cash. Shadow lenders do not finance catering bills. My parents had already drained my trust fund. They had already mortgaged their home. They had no capital left to spend. The financial pressure cooker was sealed tight, and the heat was rising. They were desperate. And desperate people always return to the same well when they run out of options. I knew it was only a matter of days before they looked across the table and decided I needed to pay for their survival. I waited for the extortion to begin. The engagement between Preston and Victoria established a ticking clock. Victoria was not just a bride. She was a corporate acquisition. Her surname represented a century of West Texas crude oil extraction. Families operating within that specific tier of generational wealth do not casually merge with failing real estate brokers. They demand a seamless display of equal status and financial parity. Victoria expected a wedding sequence that rivaled a state dinner. She required a venue with historical significance, custom silk drapery, and a guest list featuring the regional political elite. She assumed my parents possessed the capital to match her expensive tastes. Richard and Patricia viewed this union as their ultimate salvation. A marriage certificate linking Preston to the oil fortune would serve as a golden key. It would instantly unlock new lines of credit from traditional banking institutions. It would lure wealthy investors back to Morgan Properties under the assumption that the firm was backed by Victoria's family trust. They needed Victoria to walk down that aisle, or their financial collapse would become public record. The problem was the entry fee. A high society wedding is a cash-intensive operation. Shadow lenders do not accept floral arrangements as collateral. My parents had already drained my trust fund to cover their immediate debts and Preston's fake software company. They had exhausted the equity in their primary residence. The offshore account was depleted. They had no liquid capital left to spend, but they could not dare to tell Victoria the truth. Revealing their bankruptcy would end the engagement and destroy their final life raft. The pressure ruptured on a Tuesday evening. Patricia sent me a text message demanding my presence at their Highland Park home. She framed it as an urgent family planning session. I parked my used sedan in their circular driveway right next to the luxury SUV they purchased with my stolen inheritance. I walked through the vaulted foyer and headed straight for the home office. The office was a masterclass in staged prosperity. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves held leather-bound volumes nobody ever read. A heavy oak desk dominated the center of the room, polished to a high mirror shine. Patricia sat behind it. She was resting in a custom ergonomic leather chair imported from Scandinavia. I looked at that chair and recognized it immediately. The purchase date aligned perfectly with the second wire transfer from the Cayman Islands account. She was sitting on my educational trust fund while preparing to extort my current salary. Patricia did not offer me a drink. She did not engage in small talk. Her face was drawn tight, carrying the physical toll of her hidden debts. The skin around her eyes looked strained beneath her expensive makeup. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick binder. The cover was crafted from genuine Italian leather. She placed it on the polished wood and slid it across the surface until it stopped at the edge near my hands. She instructed me to open it. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover. It was the itemized budget for the rehearsal dinner. Victoria had selected a private botanical garden for the venue. The pages detailed a 5-course menu featuring imported Wagyu beef shaved truffles and a specific vintage of French champagne. I scanned the columns of numbers, calculating the running total before I even reached the final page. I flipped to the summary sheet. The catering total alone sat at $40,000. I closed the binder. I looked up at my mother, waiting for the punchline. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. She adopted a tone of maternal sacrifice, a voice she usually reserved for charity luncheons. She explained that Richard was currently tying up his capital in a large commercial acquisition. It was a lie designed to mask their bankruptcy. She claimed the family cash flow was temporarily restricted due to these brilliant investments. Then she delivered her demand. She told me it was my duty as a sister to host the rehearsal dinner. She stated that my corporate auditing salary was substantial enough to cover the $40,000 invoice. She framed the payment not as a gift, but as a mandatory demonstration of loyalty. She spun a narrative about how families must support each other during critical growth phases. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The sheer altitude of her audacity was breathtaking. She had stolen $500,000 from my name 4 months ago. She fenced my future to keep her country club membership active. Now she was demanding my literal paycheck to feed Wagyu beef to oil executives so her golden child could secure a wealthy bride. She leaned forward, her diamond rings clicking against the oak desk. She lowered her voice, attempting to sound conspiratorial. She said I lived a very modest life in my small apartment. She noted that I drove an older car and rarely took vacations. She assumed my bank accounts were overflowing with unspent income. She told me it was time to step up and invest in the Morgan family legacy. She promised that once Preston married Victoria, his new connections would elevate all of us. She expected me to fold. She expected the ingrained conditioning of family duty to override my logic. She thought I feared her disapproval more than I valued my own financial survival. She relied on the assumption that a daughter will always set herself on fire to keep her parents warm. I placed my hands flat on the desk. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone deadpan and clinical. I told her my income was not a slush fund for social climbing. The maternal facade cracked. Patricia's eyes narrowed into dark slits. The performative warmth evaporated, leaving behind a cornered predator. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. She told me I was being selfish. She accused me of hoarding my wealth while my brother stood on the verge of greatness. She warned me that refusing to pay the catering bill would cause severe embarrassment in front of Victoria's parents. She tried to manufacture guilt, claiming they sacrificed everything to raise me, and this was my chance to repay the debt. I looked at the Italian leather binder. I placed my index finger on the cover and pushed it back across the oak desk. It slid smoothly, stopping inches from her hands. I told her that if Preston wanted to feed truffles to billionaires, he should probably secure a paying job. Patricia stood up. Her chair, the one bought with my stolen money, rolled backward and hit the mahogany bookshelf. Her face flushed a dark mottled red. She dropped the elegant vocabulary and resorted to raw threats. She told me I was risking my place in the family. She said if Victoria canceled the engagement because of my stubbornness, I would be cut out of their lives forever. She promised to erase my name from their world. She did not realize I had already audited their world. I knew their world was built on default notices and shadow loans. Being cut out of a bankrupt empire is not a punishment. It is a rescue. I stood up from my seat. I adjusted the strap of my purse. I looked my mother in the eye and let her see the cold, unyielding detachment in my gaze. I did not argue. I did not defend my finances. I simply turned around and walked out of the home office. I crossed the vaulted foyer and stepped out into the humid Texas evening. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the staged prosperity. I walked to my used sedan and started the engine. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I knew the refusal was a declaration of war. By denying them the cash injection they desperately needed, I had backed them into a lethal corner. Desperate people do not surrender when you tell them no. They escalate. I knew Richard and Patricia would retaliate with everything they had left to break my resolve. They would try to destroy my reputation or sabotage my career to force my compliance. I was prepared for a brutal fight. I just did not expect the counterstrike to originate from the grave. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen counter reviewing a tax ledger for work. My cell phone vibrated against the granite. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown downtown Dallas number. I rarely answer unidentified calls, but a strange intuition compelled me to swipe the green icon. I lifted the phone to my ear and said hello. The voice on the other end was deep, gravelly, and carried the distinct cadence of a courtroom veteran. The man did not ask how my morning was going. He did not engage in pleasantries. He stated his name. He said he was Marcus Vance. He identified himself as the primary legal counsel for the estate of Thomas Morgan. He told me he required a private meeting at his office before the end of the day. He said my grandfather left a final instruction and the time had come to execute it. I parked my car in a subterranean garage beneath a towering glass structure in the center of the financial district. The morning sun was already baking the Dallas pavement, but down here the concrete was cool and damp. The phone call from Marcus Vance echoed in my mind. He offered no pleasantries and no context. He simply stated his name, identified himself as the primary legal counsel for my late grandfather, and commanded my presence. In my profession, you learn to recognize the tone of a man holding all the cards. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor, stepping into a reception area defined by dark wood paneling and profound silence. A receptionist guided me down a long corridor. There were no abstract paintings or modern art installations. The walls displayed framed topographical maps of Texas highways and vintage photographs of freight yards. This firm did not cater to tech startups or celebrity divorces. They managed generational wealth and industrial infrastructure. The receptionist opened a heavy oak door and gestured for me to enter. Marcus Vance sat behind a wide walnut desk. He was a man in his late 60s wearing a charcoal suit that fit with surgical precision. His silver hair was neatly parted, and his eyes possessed the cold, calculating stare of a predator evaluating its environment. He did not stand to greet me. He gestured to a leather chair positioned opposite his desk. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my skirt, keeping my posture rigid. Marcus studied me for a long moment. He noted my neutral expression and my steady breathing. He steepled his fingers and stated that I inherited my grandfather's posture. He said Thomas Morgan never fidgeted in a chair either. Thomas Morgan was a man who built a sprawling supply chain empire from a single corrugated metal warehouse in the 1970s. He drove his own freight trucks across state lines, sleeping in the cab to save on motel fees, until he owned the entire distribution network. He possessed dirt under his nails and a relentless drive. He measured human worth by endurance and competence. He despised the performative wealthy class. He viewed my father Richard as a tragic genetic anomaly. Richard cared only for country club memberships and imported vehicles. Thomas treated his son with a cold professional distance, knowing Richard relied entirely on aesthetics over substance. Marcus unlocked the top drawer of his desk. He withdrew a thick envelope made of heavy black paper sealed with a crimson wax stamp. He placed it directly in the center of the walnut desk. He did not push it toward me. He left it sitting there, a physical anchor in the quiet room. He asked me if I was aware of the current balance of my educational trust fund. I looked at the attorney. I kept my voice clinical. I told him I audited the account 4 months ago. I informed him that my parents forged a familial conservatorship and wired the $500,000 to an offshore holding company before routing it back into a domestic account to fund my brother's fake software venture. I delivered the facts without a single trace of emotion. Marcus did not gasp. He did not offer pity. A slow, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me my grandfather would have been proud of my forensic composure. Then Marcus dismantled my entire understanding of the theft. I explained that Thomas established the trust fund a decade before his heart failed. But Thomas was a brilliant tactician. He knew Richard was a financial parasite, draining the resources of his commercial real estate firm to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. Thomas knew that leaving me a secure vault of cash would inevitably attract my father's greed. So Thomas did not build a vault. He built a snare. Marcus leaned forward and delivered the revelation. He told me the $500,000 trust was never my true inheritance. It was a decoy. The attorney explained the structural engineering of the trap. When Marcus drafted the original trust documents, Thomas explicitly ordered him to leave the familial conservatorship clause vulnerable. It was an obscure legal loophole that a desperate man could exploit if he knew where to look. Thomas intentionally left the back door unlocked. He set the maturation date for my 25th birthday, knowing the countdown would force Richard into a panicked decision. Thomas wanted to execute a final stress test to see if his son possessed any remaining moral boundaries. I sat in the leather chair processing the ruthless brilliance of the strategy. My grandfather baited my parents. He sacrificed $500,000 to secure undeniable proof of their true nature. Marcus confirmed my thoughts. He stated that Thomas monitored Richard's declining real estate business before he passed away. Thomas knew Richard would eventually run out of traditional credit. When the pressure peaked, Richard took the bait. Marcus revealed that his firm tracked the wire transfer the moment it left the regional bank. The offshore routing numbers and the domestic deposits were already logged in the estate files. My parents believed they executed a flawless, invisible crime. In reality, they performed their theft under the direct surveillance of a master estate attorney. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of my reality. I was not a victim of a random familial betrayal. I was the surviving asset in a highly orchestrated legal war. I looked at the black envelope resting on the desk. I asked Marcus what the theft accomplished. If the $500,000 was just a decoy, I needed to know the primary objective. Marcus rested his hand on the envelope. He explained that exploiting the conservatorship clause to steal from a designated beneficiary constitutes a felony. By taking the money, Richard and Patricia violated a strict hidden morality clause written into the master estate plan. Thomas required documented, undeniable proof of their unfitness to govern the family wealth. He needed a crime on paper to legally and permanently disinherit his son without the possibility of a drawn-out court contest. They handed him the exact weapon he needed to cut them out of the bloodline forever. The theft triggered a secondary legal mechanism. Because Richard failed the stress test, the entire weight of the Morgan estate bypassed him. Marcus tapped the crimson wax seal. He told me I was holding the key to a much larger vault. The $500,000 was a fraction of the total holdings. The true inheritance was the sprawling logistics empire. Marcus outlined the timeline. Thomas died months ago, but he structured the probate execution to conclude on the exact day I received my master's degree in corporate auditing. Thomas wanted me to possess the formal credentials to manage the empire before handing me the keys. The graduation day was the final trigger. It was designed to give Richard enough rope to hang himself while giving me the time to secure my own professional foundation. I stared at the black envelope. The power sitting on that walnut desk was staggering. I realized I now possessed the legal authority to crush the people who spent my life treating me like an afterthought. But Marcus raised a hand, signaling a warning. He told me the trap only functions if the target remains entirely oblivious until the final moment. The element of surprise is the most critical component of the execution. I needed to maintain my cover as the quiet, defeated daughter. I needed to let them continue spending their stolen funds and planning their lavish society wedding. Then Marcus narrowed his eyes. He asked me what transpired the previous night. He noted that my sudden refusal to fund their rehearsal dinner destabilized the board. I told him about Patricia's extortion attempt. I explained how she demanded my auditing salary to feed Wagyu beef to Victoria's billionaire parents. I detailed my refusal and the threat she issued before I walked out of her home office. Marcus sighed. The sound was harsh in the quiet room. He warned me that cornered animals bite. By denying them the cash injection they desperately needed, I forced Richard's hand. He told me desperate men do not wait patiently for their ruin. They lash out. Marcus advised me to watch my professional perimeter. He said Richard would not accept my refusal quietly. He would attempt to cripple my independence to force my compliance. I thanked the attorney. I promised to maintain my silence until the graduation ceremony. I stood up and walked out of the law firm. The midday Texas sun glared off the concrete as I exited the building. The heat was oppressive. I reached into my purse to retrieve my car keys. My fingers brushed against my cell phone. The screen was lit up with a sequence of rapid notifications. I unlocked the device. I had 3 missed calls from the main reception desk of my corporate auditing firm. There was a direct voicemail from the senior managing partner. I pressed the audio icon and lifted the phone to my ear. My boss sounded tense. His words were clipped and hurried. He demanded I return to the office immediately and report directly to the glass conference room on the executive floor. He stated there was a severe discrepancy regarding my employment status that required immediate attention. I lowered the phone. Marcus Vance was right. My father did not wait a single day to launch his counterstrike. By refusing to fund his illusion, I made myself a target. Richard was using his remaining social capital to detonate my career. The battle had officially moved from the dining room table into my professional sanctuary. The drive from the law firm to my corporate office took less than 20 minutes. But the tension in my chest tightened with every mile. I parked my car in the employee structure and took the elevator to the executive floor. My auditing agency occupied 3 stories of a downtown Dallas high-rise. The environment was a temple of polished concrete glass walls and hushed productivity. We handled compliance and forensic accounting for regional energy sectors and commercial developers. In this specific industry, your reputation for stability is your only currency. If an auditor is perceived as erratic, their findings are immediately dismissed. My father knew this. He knew exactly where to slide the knife. I walked past the rows of junior analysts and administrative assistants. Several colleagues averted their eyes as I passed their cubicles. Gossip travels through a corporate accounting firm faster than a digital wire transfer. They knew I was summoned to the executive suite. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped in front of the primary conference room. The walls were constructed of soundproof tempered glass. Sitting at the head of a long marble table was Gregory Pierce. Gregory was the senior managing partner. He built his career investigating corporate embezzlement during the late 1990s. He possessed the warmth of a steel vault and viewed human emotion as a liability on a balance sheet. He did not tolerate excuses, and he fired people with clinical precision. He looked up from his tablet and gestured for me to enter. I pushed the heavy glass door open and took a seat halfway down the marble table. The distance was intentional. I wanted to establish a professional perimeter. Gregory set his stylus down. He did not offer a polite greeting. He folded his hands and delivered a briefing that outlined a calculated assassination of my character. He informed me that he spent his lunch hour at a private dining club in the city. His host was Richard Morgan. My father leveraged a mutual acquaintance on the country club board to secure the meeting. Gregory explained that Richard ordered premium scotch and played the role of a devastated patriarch. My father spun a narrative designed to strip me of my credibility and my livelihood. Richard told my boss that I was buckling under the academic pressure of my recent master's degree program. He claimed I was exhibiting severe emotional instability. He fabricated stories about manic episodes and irrational financial decisions. He framed my refusal to fund his lavish rehearsal dinner as a sudden disturbing break from reality. He painted a picture of a young woman losing her grip on sanity. Then Richard delivered his true objective. He leaned across the dining table and suggested that my mental fragility posed a significant liability to the auditing firm. He told Gregory it would be negligent to allow me access to sensitive corporate accounts while I was in such a volatile state. He recommended that the firm place me on immediate administrative leave for my own safety. He wanted my salary frozen and my security badge deactivated. I sat in the glass conference room, listening to the mechanics of his sabotage. The strategy was breathtakingly cruel. Richard understood that I lived in a modest apartment on a strict budget. He knew that cutting off my income would force me into eviction within 2 months. He wanted to starve me out. He wanted to break my independence so thoroughly that I would have no choice but to crawl back to his house begging for shelter. Once I was dependent on him again, he could force me to sign any legal waiver he desired. He was trying to strangle my professional life to secure his own financial survival. Gregory finished his summary. He leaned back in his leather chair and studied my face. He expected me to defend myself with tears. He expected me to raise my voice or launch into a passionate denial. He waited for the emotional outburst my father warned him about. I did not give him one. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. I set the machine on the marble table and opened the lid. I retrieved the encrypted flash drive from a zippered pocket and inserted it into the port. In financial forensics, you do not fight a lie with an argument. You fight a lie with raw, verified data. I looked at Gregory. I kept my voice stripped of all inflection. I told him my father did not buy him lunch out of parental concern. I stated that Richard Morgan was a cornered debtor, attempting to neutralize an auditor who recently uncovered his insolvency. I turned my laptop screen toward the senior partner. I opened the digital dossier I compiled earlier that week. I did not discuss the stolen trust fund or the offshore accounts. Those were personal crimes. Gregory only cared about commercial realities. I walked him through the forensic breakdown of Morgan properties. I clicked on the first set of files. I showed him the public tenancy records indicating the sudden departure of my father's 2 anchor commercial clients. I highlighted the exact dates the square footage went dark. I moved to the county lion registries. I displayed the series of uniform commercial code filings registered against his firm in the last 8 months. I pointed out the predatory interest rates attached to the shadow loans he secured against his empty warehouses and his corporate office space. I scrolled down to the secondary collateral agreements. I showed Gregory the documents proving my father mortgaged his luxury vehicles and his country club equity just to make payroll. I laid out a timeline of terminal cash flow deficit. I let the silence hang in the conference room. Gregory leaned forward, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers and the dates of the default notices. I was a veteran investigator. He recognized a flawless audit when he saw one. He processed the data, evaluating the true motive behind the lunch meeting. He realized Richard was not protecting a fragile daughter. Richard was executing a preemptive strike against a witness. Gregory looked up from the screen. The cold, detached demeanor shifted into a look of profound professional respect. He saw a junior employee who possessed the nerve to silently audit her own family and the discipline to present the findings without a single tremor in her voice. He reached across the table and pushed the laptop back toward me. He stated that the firm had no interest in participating in a domestic hostage situation. He informed me that my employment status was secure. Then he did something unexpected. He opened a manila folder resting near his tablet. He slid a crisp, printed contract across the marble. He told me the firm recently acquired a new account overseeing the compliance restructuring of a major regional logistics provider. The client required a lead auditor who possessed zero tolerance for superficial posturing and an instinct for identifying hidden liabilities. He said my handling of this personal crisis demonstrated the exact psychological profile he needed for the position. He offered me the lead role. It came with a substantial salary increase and a dedicated office on the executive floor. Richard tried to orchestrate my firing. He handed me a promotion instead. I signed the contract right there in the glass room. I thanked Gregory for his objectivity. I packed my laptop and the encrypted drive back into my bag. I was preparing to leave the conference room when Gregory made a passing comment that changed the entire trajectory of my investigation. He mentioned that the data I provided on Morgan Properties contained a familiar corporate entity. He noted that the holding company listed as the primary landlord for my father's empty commercial warehouses was Morgan Supply Chains. I paused with my hand on the glass door. Morgan Supply Chains was the exact name of the logistics empire my grandfather built. It was the empire Marcus Vance told me I was about to inherit. I had overlooked a critical connection in my own spreadsheet. My father's real estate firm did not own the land beneath his empty buildings. He leased those structures. And the entity holding the leases was the estate of Thomas Morgan. The grandfather who laid the trap for my father was also his commercial landlord. I thanked Gregory again and walked out of the conference room. I bypassed my old cubicle and headed straight for the elevator. The promotion was a victory, but the war was far from over. I needed to return to my apartment and dissect the corporate architecture of my grandfather's empire. If Richard was leasing his failing properties from Morgan Supply Chains, I needed to know the exact terms of those contracts. The trap Marcus Vance described was much deeper than a simple disinheritance. I needed to uncover the mechanism of the shell game before the graduation ceremony. I left the corporate high-rise and navigated my car through the dense afternoon traffic. The revelation from my managing partner echoed in my mind. My father's failing real estate firm was a direct tenant of my grandfather's supply chain empire. I needed to understand the comprehensive scope of that relationship before my graduation ceremony. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building and immediately dialed the direct line for Marcus Vance. The attorney answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with introductory remarks. I told him I uncovered the commercial link between Richard and the estate. I requested immediate access to the private corporate ledgers for Morgan Supply Chains. Marcus remained silent for a brief moment. He noted that I was moving faster than he anticipated. He warned me that examining the internal architecture of the company would reveal a level of financial vulnerability that might test my composure. I assured him my composure was intact. 10 minutes later, a secure encrypted link arrived in my email inbox, accompanied by a temporary administrative password. I sat at my small kitchen table. The sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. I opened my laptop, entered the credentials, and bypassed the digital security firewalls. The internal server of Morgan Supply Chains loaded onto my screen. I spent the next 4 hours mapping the architecture of my grandfather's life work. Thomas did not deal in theoretical valuations or speculative technology. He built a fortress of liquid capital and physical assets. The ledgers detailed a vast network of commercial freight routes stretching across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The company owned hundreds of refrigerated transport vehicles, logistics hubs in major coastal ports, and acres of industrial concrete. It was an empire built on the unyielding mechanics of moving actual goods from one destination to another. The contrast between this tangible wealth and the hollow posturing of my family was striking. Preston rented a luxury penthouse to pretend he was an entrepreneur while his software generated zero revenue. Richard joined exclusive country clubs and drove imported vehicles to project success, while his real estate firm drowned in predatory debt. Thomas wore steel-toed boots and built an enterprise that generated millions in verified monthly cash flow. My grandfather understood that true wealth does not require a stage, it requires a foundation. I opened the subsidiary holding files to locate the property division. I cross-referenced the corporate addresses with the data I previously gathered on Morgan Properties. The search query aligned perfectly. The structural vulnerability of my father's business appeared on my screen in stark black and white. Richard did not own the land beneath his commercial warehouses. He did not own the steel framing or the concrete foundations. He operated under a master lease agreement negotiated over a decade ago. Morgan Supply Chains owned the physical properties. Richard merely leased the square footage at a wholesale rate and subleased it to his regional clients at a premium. His entire business model relied on skimming the profit margin between the master lease and the subtenant contracts. I clicked into the accounts receivable ledger for the property division. I located the specific tenant file for Morgan Properties. I opened the billing history and stared at the columns of numbers. Richard had not paid rent on his primary commercial spaces in 6 months. The delinquency was staggering. I traced the dates of his missed payments. The first default occurred the exact same month he lost his 2 anchor clients. When his subtenants vacated the warehouses, his cash flow evaporated. Instead of downsizing or restructuring his debts, he chose to maintain his lavish lifestyle. He kept paying his country club dues. He kept the luxury vehicles. He simply stopped paying rent to his own father's company. He assumed Thomas would never evict his own son. He relied on the shield of family loyalty to protect him from the consequences of his financial negligence. But Thomas was a man of strict commercial discipline. I opened the correspondence archive attached to the tenant file. My grandfather issued a formal notice of default 30 days before his heart failed. He warned Richard that the legacy contract would be terminated if the arrears were not settled. Thomas died before the eviction could be executed. The timing of his passing saved Richard from immediate ruin. In commercial law, when the sole owner of a private corporation passes away, the estate enters a legal holding pattern known as probate. All assets are frozen. The executor of the estate assumes a fiduciary duty to maintain the status quo until the probate period concludes and the assets are legally transferred to the designated heir. Marcus Vance could not initiate an eviction against Morgan Properties without explicit authorization from the new owner. And the new owner did not yet possess the legal authority to sign the termination papers. The trap my grandfather constructed was a masterpiece of legal engineering. He structured his will so the probate period would remain active until the exact moment I received my master degree. He deliberately extended the timeline. He knew Richard was drowning in arrears. He knew Richard would use the probate freeze as an excuse to continue withholding rent. Thomas gave his son enough rope to hang himself multiple times over. By the time I walked across the graduation stage, Richard would owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in back rent and late penalties. The moment the university conferred my degree, the probate would clear. The legal title to Morgan Supply Chains would transfer directly into my name. I would instantly become the chief executive officer of the empire. More importantly, I would become my father's landlord. I sat in my quiet apartment processing the sheer magnitude of the weapon my grandfather placed in my hands. The moment the estate unfroze, I would possess the unilateral legal authority to execute the eviction notices. I could terminate his master leases, lock the doors on his warehouses, and seize his remaining business assets to satisfy the unpaid debt. I could crush his entire corporate existence with a single signature. The power was intoxicating, but it required tactical patience. If Richard suspected I was the primary heir, he would scramble his remaining resources. He would file emergency bankruptcy protections or attempt to tie the estate up in endless civil litigation. He needed to believe he was still playing a game he could win. He needed to remain focused on his illusion until the trap snapped shut. I closed the server portal and shut down my laptop. The graduation ceremony was only a few days away. The legal execution was prepared. The financial data was secure. The only remaining obstacle was a social one. Before we reached the banquet hall, my family had to endure the wedding festivities. Preston and Victoria scheduled their rehearsal dinner for Thursday evening. The event was designed to be the ultimate showcase of their fabricated status. My parents intended to use the gathering to impress Victoria's billionaire father and secure the social leverage they needed to survive their hidden debts. They expected me to attend. They expected me to sit quietly in the background and play the role of the submissive daughter while they drank expensive wine and lied to a room full of oil executives. They thought my refusal to pay the catering bill was my only act of rebellion. They assumed my spirit was broken after Richard attempted to sabotage my auditing career. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a simple black dress. I needed to attend that dinner. I needed to observe them at the absolute peak of their delusion. Watching a target celebrate a victory they have not earned is a critical phase of any forensic audit. It reveals their final vulnerabilities. The rehearsal dinner would provide the perfect stage for their illusion, and I was ready to buy a front-row ticket to their impending collapse. The Texas highway stretched north from the city concrete, transitioning into the sprawling open acreage of the surrounding hill country. Thursday evening carried a stifling heat, but the air began to cool as I steered my used sedan onto a private access road lined with ancient oak trees. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, signaling my arrival at the historic ranch estate Victoria selected for the rehearsal dinner. The property featured a restored limestone mansion surrounded by manicured botanical gardens and sweeping terraces. It was a venue designed to project unquestionable prosperity and generational permanence. I pulled up to the front entrance and shifted into park. A valet dressed in a sharp black uniform approached my window. He tried to hide his brief hesitation as he took the keys to my high-mileage vehicle. He was accustomed to handling the heavy metallic keys for the imported sports cars and luxury European sedans currently lining the circular driveway. I stepped out of the car, wearing the simple dark dress I selected from my closet earlier that afternoon. I did not wear jewelry. I carried a plain leather purse. I walked toward the terrace with the quiet, measured gait of an investigator stepping onto an active crime scene. The rehearsal dinner was a masterclass in optical deception. Long wooden tables draped in white linen stretched across the manicured lawn. Strings of amber lights illuminated the twilight, casting a warm, forgiving glow over the attendees. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with seared prime beef, rare vintage wine, and imported cheeses. The air smelled of expensive cologne, roasted garlic, and blooming jasmine. It was a sensory overload intended to pacify the guests and distract from the rotting foundation beneath their feet. I navigated the perimeter of the gathering, locating a quiet table in the far corner. I sat down and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. From this vantage point, I possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the entire operation. My gaze anchored first on the bride. Victoria stood near a roaring stone fire pit, holding a crystal flute. She belonged to the third generation of a West Texas oil dynasty. Her grandfather pulled crude from the dirt, using callous hands and brutal labor. He built an empire based on tangible yields and hard physical assets. Victoria inherited the yields, but none of the labor. She existed in a reality where capital was an atmospheric condition. She simply breathed without thought. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the amber light with every turn of her head. Her voice carried across the terrace, sharp and unbothered. She was busy describing her upcoming honeymoon in the Mediterranean and her plans to renovate a historic property in the city. She spoke of a future defined entirely by permanent leisure. She assumed the man standing next to her possessed the financial gravity to match her lifestyle. She had no idea she was marrying a hollow shell. Preston played the role of the triumphant tech founder with sickening ease. He stood beside Victoria wearing a custom-tailored jacket that fit with flawless precision. He held a glass of dark liquor, smiling confidently as he entertained a circle of older men. These men were oil executives and regional banking directors. They understood pipelines and interest rates, but they were vulnerable to the intoxicating jargon of the technology sector. Preston fed them a steady diet of buzzwords. He spoke of scalable infrastructure paradigm shifts and disruptive logistics. He acted like a visionary, on the brink of reshaping the digital landscape. I sat in the shadows and watched his mouth move, translating his lies into raw forensic data. I knew the exact status of the operating accounts he bragged about. His software company generated zero revenue. He possessed zero active clients. His entire enterprise was a vanity project funded by the $500,000 Richard and Patricia stole from my educational trust. His effortless confidence was purchased with my stolen inheritance. The bespoke jacket he wore was financed by the arrears on commercial warehouse leases. He was a walking liability pretending to be an asset. He clinked his glass against the glass of a billionaire, oblivious to the fact that his own bank accounts were destined to be frozen by the end of the week. My attention shifted to the architects of this illusion. Patricia circulated among the wealthy guests, moving with the predatory grace of a cornered debtor. She wore a silk evening gown and held a glass of the vintage wine. She targeted Victoria's father, engaging him in a prolonged conversation near the open bar. Patricia smiled, tilted her head, and projected an aura of supreme invulnerability. She laughed at his jokes and touched his arm, establishing a false camaraderie. Every smile my mother offered was a calculated lie. Every sip of champagne she swallowed was paid for by defaulted shadow loans. Richard stood nearby, mirroring her performance. He shook hands with potential investors, handing out embossed business cards for a real estate firm that sat on the edge of total collapse. They operated under a shared delusion. They convinced themselves that if they could just keep the music playing until the marriage certificate was signed, they would be saved. They believed they had successfully navigated their financial ruin. They thought their theft was untraceable, and their future was secure. I sat alone at my corner table, drinking my sparkling water. The isolation was not a punishment. It was a tactical advantage. When you remain silent, people forget you are in the room. They let their guard down. They reveal the structural flaws in their performance. I looked at my family, laughing and drinking under the amber lights. They were constructing a towering house of cards, directly on top of a foundation soaked in gasoline. All they needed was a single spark. I reached into my leather purse and withdrew my cell phone. I kept the screen dimmed to avoid drawing attention. I opened my encrypted messaging application and checked the secure channel I established with Marcus Vance. The estate attorney sent a brief status update 5 minutes prior. The message confirmed that the final eviction notices for Morgan properties were drafted and notarized. The documentation to seize the operating accounts of Preston's software venture was locked and ready for execution. Marcus stated he was personally monitoring the countdown. The probate freeze on the supply chain empire would lift the exact second the university conferred my master's degree on Saturday afternoon. The legal strike was fully coordinated and ready for deployment. I typed a short reply acknowledging the update and returned the device to my purse. I looked back up at the party. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the surrounding hill country into darkness. The string lights burned brighter against the night sky. The dinner service commenced, and the guests began moving toward their assigned seats at the long wooden tables. The evening appeared seamless. The deception was holding together flawlessly. But as the waiters began clearing the main course plates and preparing for the dessert service, I noticed a shift in my mother's demeanor. Patricia broke away from her conversation with Victoria's parents. The performative warmth vanished from her face the moment she turned her back to the oil executives. Her posture stiffened. She scanned the terrace with rapid, darting eyes, until she located me sitting alone in the corner. Her gaze locked onto my table. The quiet observation phase of the evening was officially over. Richard and Patricia needed a final guarantee to ensure their survival. They needed to sever my remaining ties to the estate before the wedding took place. I watched Patricia grip her designer clutch tight against her side and begin walking directly toward my table. The shadows from the stone fire pit flickered across her face, revealing the raw, unvarnished desperation hiding just beneath her expensive makeup. She was coming to demand my surrender, and she brought the paperwork to make it permanent. The waitstaff began their final choreographed rotation across the manicured lawn. They moved in seamless patterns, distributing porcelain plates, holding delicate chocolate tortes, adorned with edible gold leaf. The string quartet shifted from classical arrangements into a lively modern tempo. The wealthy guests leaned back in their wooden chairs, distracted by the sugar and the music. The atmosphere grew loud and saturated with the false comfort of high society. Patricia used this collective distraction to make her move. She stepped away from the table where she had been entertaining Victoria's parents. The performative warmth vanished from her face the second she turned her back to the oil executives. Her posture went rigid. She walked directly toward my isolated corner table. She did not sit down. She did not offer a motherly greeting. She stopped 2 feet away and delivered a sharp upward flick of her wrist. It was a silent, nonverbal command, instructing me to follow her. She turned and walked briskly toward the heavy glass doors that separated the outdoor terrace from the interior of the historic limestone mansion. I stood up and followed her. I kept my breathing slow and my expression neutral. I wanted to see what kind of leverage she believed she possessed. We stepped through the glass doors into a dark, quiet hallway. The ambient light from the amber bulbs outside barely penetrated the tinted glass. The lively music became a muffled, distant hum. The air conditioning inside the mansion was sharp and frigid against my skin. Patricia stood in the shadows. The muscles in her jaw were tight. Up close, without the benefit of the flattering terrace lighting, she looked exhausted. The financial strain was carving deep lines around her mouth. She opened her clutch. It was a designer accessory studded with small crystals, but her hands were shaking as she unclasped the metal latch. She reached inside and pulled out a folded piece of thick legal stock paper. She handed it to me. I unfolded the document. The paper was heavy and carried the watermark of a local downtown law firm. I held it up to catch the dim light filtering through the glass doors. My eyes scanned the boilerplate text. It was titled as a formal waiver of succession. It was drafted to look like a routine administrative form, but the core language buried in the second paragraph was lethal. It contained a specific binding clause stating that I willingly surrendered any and all current or future claims to the estate of Thomas Morgan. It legally transferred my position as an heir directly to my father Richard. Patricia spoke in a harsh, frantic whisper. She told me the probate attorneys needed to close the remaining ledgers on the estate before the end of the month. She claimed it was a standard procedural requirement for all family members to sign a release form, so the final tax burdens could be calculated and settled. She told me I needed to sign the document right now to prevent the federal government from auditing my late grandfather and penalizing the family. She delivered the lie with practiced urgency. She thought she was speaking to a naive child who would buckle under the threat of government intervention. She forgot she was speaking to a corporate auditor. I read the document and instantly mapped the actual financial mechanics at play. The shadow lenders holding the predatory mortgages on Richard's real estate firm were demanding further collateral. They knew Thomas Morgan was dead. They knew Richard was a direct blood relative. But private hard money lenders do not accept unverified potential inheritance as collateral for failing loans. They require clear, unencumbered title. Richard was trying to leverage my grandfather's supply chain empire to secure a new cash injection before the wedding bills came due. To satisfy the lenders and secure the bridge loan, he needed to prove he was the sole heir to the Morgan fortune. He needed my name removed from the bloodline entirely. He needed me to sign away an empire so he could borrow enough money to keep his fake software CEO son looking rich for a few more weeks. Patricia reached back into her clutch and produced a silver pen. She held it out to me. She told me to sign my name on the bottom line. I did not take the pen immediately. I looked at the legal stock paper and then looked at her. I told her I preferred to have my own legal counsel review any binding waivers before affixing my signature to a formal document. The refusal triggered a raw panic in her eyes. The mask of the elegant society matriarch shattered completely. She stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us. She hissed that I was ruining the most important week of Preston's life. She told me I had 2 choices. I could sign the paper and return to my corner table, or she would signal the private security detail working the perimeter of the estate. She threatened to have the armed guards physically escort me off the property in front of Victoria's billionaire parents. She intended to frame me as a disruptive, unstable guest and humiliate me in front of the regional elite. She was weaponizing social shame. She evaluated human behavior exclusively through the lens of country club politics. She assumed I feared public embarrassment as much as she did. She failed to comprehend that a person holding an encrypted flash drive containing proof of multiple federal felonies does not care about looking foolish at a dinner party. I looked at the forged waiver. My father likely paid a desperate paralegal to draft it outside of regular firm hours. It held no actual legal weight while the estate was frozen in probate, but giving them my signature would grant them a temporary illusion of control. It would allow Richard to walk into a shadow meeting tomorrow morning, slide the waiver across a table, and buy himself another few days of borrowed time. I felt a strong urge to tell her the truth. I wanted to tell her that Marcus Vance was already monitoring her movements. I wanted to tell her that the eviction notices for her husband's commercial real estate firm were already notarized and sitting on a walnut desk, waiting for my authorization. I wanted to break her delusion right there in the dark hallway and watch her process the reality of her impending bankruptcy. But premature action is the enemy of a perfect audit. An investigator never tips their hand before the final trap is set. If I revealed my knowledge tonight, Richard would spend his Friday liquidating whatever minor assets he had left and attempting to flee the jurisdiction. The execution required the stage of the graduation ceremony. It required the presence of the exact people they were trying to impress. I needed to let them keep their false hope for 48 more hours. I reached out and took the silver pen from her hand. Patricia exhaled a sharp breath. Relief washed over her features, softening the harsh lines around her mouth. She thought her threat succeeded. She thought the fear of being escorted out by security forced my compliance. I placed the thick paper against the glass pane of the terrace door to use it as a hard surface. I uncapped the pen. I placed the metal tip directly on the dotted line designated for my signature. I did not write my name. I applied firm pressure to the silver barrel. I drew a single straight black line directly through the signature block. I dragged the dark ink across the entire width of the page, crossing out the legal phrasing entirely and rendering the document void. I capped the pen. I handed the ruined document and the silver pen back to my mother. She looked down at the paper. Her mind struggled to process the bold black strike running across the page. The relief on her face morphed into pure, unadulterated horror. She looked up at me, her mouth opening to speak, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The reality of my defiance paralyzed her. I did not offer an explanation. I did not engage in a debate. I turned my back on her and pushed open the heavy front doors of the mansion. I walked down the stone steps and headed toward the valet stand. I handed my ticket to the attendant and waited in the cool night air for my car. I left Patricia standing alone in the dark shadows of the hallway, holding a voided contract and facing the imminent collapse of her fraudulent empire. The rehearsal dinner was over. The stage was now set for the graduation ceremony. 48 hours after I dragged a black ink pen across my mother's forged document, the timeline converged on Saturday afternoon. The university auditorium echoed with applause as the dean handed me the leather folio containing my master's degree in corporate auditing. I walked across the stage, listening to my name resonate through the sound system. Richard and Patricia sat in the upper mezzanine. They did not stand. They did not cheer. They treated the commencement ceremony as a tedious waiting period before their own planned event. We relocated to the ballroom of a luxury downtown Dallas hotel. This was the same room where the initial hook of my story began. The reception was ostensibly organized to celebrate my academic milestone. In reality, it was a carefully engineered networking mixer designed to project familial perfection. Texas corporate culture treats these high society gatherings as stages for performing solvency. My parents needed to prove their financial viability to Victoria's powerful relatives and the remaining local investors. The ballroom was a study in optical deception. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, forgiving glow over the attendees. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays, offering shrimp cocktails and imported caviar. A sprawling ice sculpture anchored the center of the room. Patricia spent the last 2 days operating in a state of suppressed panic. The ruined waiver I handed her on Thursday night severed her final lifeline to the private shadow lenders. She masked her terror today by micromanaging the catering staff and avoiding my gaze. She wore a bright floral silk dress, acting the part of the triumphant matriarch, but her hands trembled every time she picked up her champagne flute. Preston mingled near the open bar. His software company was already a sinking ship, but my family excels at pivoting to new illusions. Tonight, they intended to announce his appointment to a prestigious corporate advisory board. In the Dallas business ecosystem, board seats are often traded like social currency among failing elites. Placing Preston on an advisory board would grant him a veneer of institutional legitimacy without requiring him to perform actual daily labor. It was a desperate maneuver to convince Victoria's oil tycoon father that Preston belonged in their specific tax bracket. I stood near the center of the hall. The black graduation gown felt heavy over my clothes, but I kept it zipped to the collar. I held the degree in my hands. The leather folio was smooth and cool. I watched the oil executives and the regional developers sip their premium drinks. These men built fortunes extracting resources from the earth and constructing concrete skylines. They respected hard numbers and verified yields. They did not realize they were currently standing inside an active financial crime scene. They were drinking liquor paid for by a liquidated trust fund and stolen equity. I looked at Victoria standing next to my brother. She wore a tailored white dress and laughed at a joke a banker made. Her father stood a few feet away, observing the room with the quiet scrutiny of a man who evaluates risk for a living. He built his oil firm by recognizing bad investments before they collapsed. He watched Richard and Preston with a cautious, measured gaze. He was looking for cracks in the foundation. A waiter tapped a silver spoon against a crystal glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient jazz playing from the corner speakers. The low murmur of conversations faded as the guests turned their attention toward the front of the room. Richard stepped up to a microphone positioned near the stage. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered a warm, practiced smile to the crowd. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium. His knuckles turned pale, revealing the immense physical tension hiding beneath his tailored suit. Richard began a monologue about legacy. He spoke about the weight of generational responsibility and the duty of passing the torch to the next era of innovators. He wove a narrative of American resilience, quoting tired platitudes about building futures through vision and unwavering grit. He utilized the vocabulary of a successful executive, dropping phrases like strategic growth and market synergy. He played the role of the benevolent king, surveying his prosperous kingdom. He did not look at me. The daughter who just spent 3 grueling years analyzing tax codes and forensic ledgers did not fit his narrative of success. I was the silent workhorse. I did not generate the flashy optics required for his social climbing. I stood 10 feet away, holding the highest academic credential in the room, and I was entirely invisible to him. He was using the reception funded by his remaining credit lines to celebrate the son who stole my inheritance. Richard turned his attention to Preston. He pointed toward my brother, praising his non-existent business acumen. He lauded Preston's transition from software founder to corporate advisor, treating the fabricated board seat as a monumental achievement in modern commerce. Victoria smiled next to Preston, her diamond pendant reflecting the chandelier light. Her father offered a polite nod, but his eyes remained sharp and analytical. Richard was fighting to win the room. He was selling the lie with flawless execution, pouring all his remaining energy into the performance. I checked the face of my watch. The timing was precise. The probate period for my grandfather's estate expired, the exact minute the university registrar stamped my degree into the official digital ledger. That administrative action occurred over an hour ago. The legal shield protecting Richard from eviction was gone. The freeze on the supply chain empire was lifted. I was no longer just an auditing graduate. I was the chief executive officer of his primary commercial landlord. Richard raised his champagne flute high in the air to propose a toast to his own fabricated success. He opened his mouth, taking a breath to deliver the final triumphant punchline of his speech. He intended to cement his status and secure the confidence of Victoria's family in one sweeping declaration. He never spoke the words. The heavy wooden doors at the very back of the banquet hall swung open. They hit the brass wall stoppers with a loud, resonant thud. The sudden noise shattered the polite atmosphere. The ambient jazz music seemed to falter. The remaining quiet chatter among the guests faded into dead silence. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage to the entrance. Marcus Vance stepped across the threshold. The senior estate attorney wore his immaculate charcoal suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase in his right hand, gripping the handle with the authority of a federal prosecutor. He did not come alone. 2 corporate security officers in dark suits flanked him. Their presence signaled a stark departure from a social visit. Security personnel do not march into high society graduation parties unless they are preparing to lock down a perimeter or escort someone out of the building. The air conditioning kicked on, sending a chill through the silent room. Patricia dropped her champagne glass. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. The sound of breaking crystal echoed in the quiet space. Richard froze mid-toast, his arms still raised in the air, his mouth hanging slightly open. His eyes locked onto the attorney. The arrogant posture dissolved instantly, replaced by the raw, unvarnished panic of a man realizing his debts have finally come due. The execution had officially arrived. Marcus Vance moved down the center aisle of the ballroom with the deliberate pacing of a man who controls time. The 2 corporate security officers accompanying him peeled off as they reached the front of the room. One officer stood near the primary exit doors, blocking the path. The second officer positioned himself near the catering entrance. They did not draw weapons or issue verbal commands. They simply crossed their arms and established a physical perimeter. In the corporate sector, you lock down the exits during a hostile takeover to prevent panicked executives from making phone calls or shredding documents. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Nobody was leaving until the execution concluded. Richard stood on the small wooden stage. His hand gripped the microphone stand with white knuckles. He tried to maintain his confident smile, but the facial muscles betrayed him, twitching near his jawline. He looked down at the estate attorney ascending the 3 short steps to the platform. Richard did not demand an explanation. He did not ask Marcus why he was interrupting a private reception. A guilty man recognizes his judge the moment he walks into the room. Marcus did not wait for an invitation to take the floor. He stepped directly in front of my father. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the microphone. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, clinging to the metal cylinder. It was a pathetic final attempt to hold on to his illusion of power. Marcus offered a single cold look and pulled the microphone from his grip. Richard's fingers uncurled. He stepped back, shrinking into the shadows of the stage lighting. Marcus adjusted the height of the stand. The speakers emitted a low, brief hum. He looked out over the sea of wealthy guests. He saw the Texas oil executives, the regional bankers, and the commercial real estate developers. He understood the exact social ecosystem my parents were trying to manipulate. He knew how to dismantle it. He introduced himself without raising his voice. He stated his name and his title as the primary executor and legal counsel for the estate of Thomas Morgan. The mention of my grandfather's name sent a visible ripple through the front rows. Thomas was a legend in the Dallas logistics sector. The men sitting at those tables respected the supply chain empire he built. They leaned forward, setting their drinks down on the white linen tablecloths. Their attention shifted entirely from Richard to the attorney. Marcus explained the legal mechanics of a probate freeze. He informed the room that an estate of this magnitude requires a triggering event to finalize the transfer of assets. He told them the trigger was not tied to a calendar date or a fiscal quarter. The trigger was tied to an academic ledger. He announced that at 2 o'clock this afternoon, the university registrar officially recorded the conferral of a master's degree in corporate auditing. He stated that the legal holding pattern concluded exactly 1 hour ago. He unlatched the brass locks on his thick leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the silent ballroom. He reached inside and withdrew a heavy bound document. It was printed on thick legal stock paper secured with heavy binding rings. It was the master estate plan. Marcus turned his body slightly to address Richard and Patricia. My mother stood near the ice sculpture, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. Marcus spoke to them, but he ensured the microphone picked up every single word for the audience. He brought up the $500,000 educational trust fund. He did not use polite euphemisms. He stated that 4 months ago, Richard and Patricia utilized a forged familial conservatorship to bypass security protocols. He detailed the offshore wire transfer to the Cayman Islands and the subsequent deposit into a domestic shell company. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The polite curiosity mutated into sharp professional judgment. Victoria's father, the billionaire oil tycoon, narrowed his eyes. In his world, you can excuse a bad investment, but you never excuse wire fraud. He looked at Richard with a chilling mixture of realization and disgust. He understood that he was sitting in a room funded by stolen capital. Marcus tapped the heavy bound document resting on the podium. He explained that Thomas Morgan engineered that trust fund as a deliberate decoy. He told the room that Thomas recognized his son's terminal lack of integrity. My grandfather needed undeniable verified proof that Richard was unfit to inherit the family wealth. He placed the $500,000 in a vulnerable account and waited to see if his son would harvest the assets of his own daughter. Marcus read the specific legal phrasing from the master plan. He cited the hidden morality clause. The text stipulated that any fiduciary breach committed against a designated beneficiary would trigger an immediate, unalterable consequence. By stealing the money, Richard failed the final stress test. He handed the estate the exact legal weapon required to sever him from the bloodline. The attorney delivered the verdict with the cold authority of a federal judge. He announced that Richard and Patricia Morgan were permanently disinherited from all family wealth. He stated they held no claim to any liquid accounts, no rights to any commercial properties, and no access to any corporate dividends. They were legally stripped of the Morgan legacy. Patricia let out a soft, ragged gasp. She reached out and grabbed the edge of a cocktail table to keep her balance. The social standing she spent 30 years cultivating was incinerated in less than 3 minutes. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch. She was a documented thief standing in front of her peers. Richard stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who just survived a plane crash only to realize he was stranded in a desert. Marcus turned his attention away from the wreckage of my parents. He looked out into the crowd, scanning the faces, until his eyes locked onto me. I stood near the center of the hall wearing my black graduation gown, holding my leather folio. I kept my posture rigid. I did not smile. I met his gaze with the steady professional detachment of a forensic auditor. The attorney addressed the silent room. He prepared to read the final mandate. He explained that the morality clause did not just disinherit the thief, it redirected the entire weight of the estate to the surviving target of the theft. Marcus read the inventory. He listed the commercial freight routes stretching across 3 states. He listed the refrigerated transport fleet. He named the logistics hubs in the coastal ports. He detailed the hundreds of acres of industrial concrete and the subsidiary holding companies managing the real estate leases. He painted a picture of a sprawling fortress built on liquid capital and hard assets. I took a breath and delivered the final sentence. He stated that Thomas Morgan transferred total unencumbered ownership of Morgan Supply Chains and all subsidiary holdings directly to Cecilia Morgan. He declared me the sole heir and the absolute owner of the empire. The sheer scale of the disparity hit the room like a physical shockwave. My parents risked federal prison and public ruin to steal $500,000. They threw away their integrity for a fraction of the total wealth. In their greed, they triggered the mechanism that handed me an enterprise worth tens of millions. They spent my inheritance to buy a temporary illusion, and in return my grandfather handed me the keys to a permanent kingdom. Marcus closed the heavy bound document. He stepped away from the podium and walked down the short wooden stairs. He navigated the silent crowd until he reached my position in the center of the hall. He held the master estate plan out to me. I took the thick document from his hands. The paper felt heavy and substantial. It was the physical manifestation of my grandfather's trust in my competence. Marcus offered a single brief nod, acknowledging the transfer of power. He stepped aside, yielding the floor entirely to me. The ballroom remained frozen. The oil executives, the regional bankers, and my disgraced family all watched me. They waited to see what the new chief executive officer of Morgan Supply Chains would do with her newly acquired authority. They expected me to offer a tearful speech, or perhaps walk out of the room in shock. They did not realize I spent the last 4 months mapping the exact vulnerabilities of my father's real estate firm. They did not know I had an eviction notice waiting to be authorized. The legal transfer was complete, but the financial execution was just beginning. I turned my body and began walking toward the stage. The physical weight of the bound estate plan grounds me. I step past Marcus Vance and walk toward the wooden stage. My black graduation gown sweeps against the polished floorboards. The crowd parts, forming a wide corridor. The regional developers and banking executives step aside, granting me a clear, unobstructed path. I ascend the 3 short stairs to the platform. Richard stumbles backward. His heel catches the heavy brass leg of a catering table, and he sinks heavily into a velvet chair. The color drains from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He is a man processing a fatal diagnosis. He realizes the specific structural reality of his new existence. The daughter he systematically abused and robbed now controls the concrete beneath his feet. Patricia stands near the dessert station. Her mind finally connects the legal disinheritance to her immediate physical reality. She reaches for a fresh champagne flute from a passing silver tray, attempting to steady her trembling hands. Her fingers fail to grip the crystal stem. She drops the glass. It shatters against the hardwood floor, sending sharp, transparent shards sliding across the aisle. The noise makes several guests flinch, but Patricia does not look down. She stares at me, her eyes wide with unvarnished terror. She looks toward the wealthy women she spent decades courting, seeking a sympathetic gaze. The society wives turn their heads away, refusing to make eye contact. Patricia understands that the eviction notices Marcus Vance mentioned do not just apply to corporate ledgers. They apply to her lifestyle, her social standing, and her physical comfort. She is instantly exiled. I do not stay silent to let them process their grief. I step up to the podium and adjust the microphone. The metal stand squeaks slightly in the quiet room. I look out over the audience. I see the wealthy investors, the oil tycoons, and the silent security officers blocking the exits. I do not address the crowd. I lock my eyes on my father. I speak with the clear, steady cadence of an auditor delivering a final terminal report. I remove all emotion from my voice. I treat him like a failing spreadsheet. I call him by his first name. I tell Richard that a forensic review of the Morgan Supply Chain's property division concluded yesterday afternoon. I explain to the room that his commercial real estate firm operates on a fundamental deception. For 2 decades, he utilized a legacy master lease granted by his father. He rented premium industrial square footage at a steep family discount and subleased it to regional distributors at a premium markup. His entire margin of wealth was a subsidy provided by the man who just disinherited him. He never built anything. He merely collected a toll on his father's infrastructure. I outline the specific ledger entries. I name the 3 primary distribution hubs located near the interstate. I state the exact duration those accounts have sat in delinquency. I inform him that he is 6 months in default on his warehouse leases. The number hangs in the air. 6 months. In the Texas commercial real estate sector, a half year of unpaid rent is not a clerical oversight. It is an intentional, unrecoverable failure. The executives sitting in the front rows exchange sharp, knowing glances. The men who were shaking his hand and drinking his wine 20 minutes ago now look at him as if he carries a terminal contagion. I explain the legal mechanism protecting him until this exact moment. I tell him the only shield preventing his ruin was the probate freeze on the estate. He assumed the legal holding pattern would last long enough for him to secure a new shadow loan using my forged signature. He believed he could borrow his way out of the deficit before the new owner assumed control. I lean closer to the microphone. I tell him the freeze is lifted. The legal title is officially registered in my name. The shield is gone. As the new chief executive officer of Morgan Supply Chains, I announce the immediate termination of his legacy contracts. The words echo across the ballroom. The termination of a master lease means his real estate firm possesses zero inventory. Without the warehouses, he has no product to offer his subtenants. His entire revenue stream evaporates in a single sentence. I inform him that formal eviction notices were filed and stamped by the county court clerk this morning. The county sheriff will post those notices on the doors of his commercial properties at dawn on Monday. The facility locks will be changed. The digital security codes will be wiped. His remaining subtenants will be instructed to route their lease payments directly to my holding company. Richard grips the armrests of his chair. He opens his mouth to speak, but no sound emerges. Sweat beads on his forehead, reflecting the chandelier light. His custom silk tie suddenly looks like a noose around his neck. He is paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his life. But I do not stop at the eviction. An audit requires a comprehensive disclosure of all liabilities. I detail the cascading effect of the contract termination. I explain to the room that Richard recently engaged unregulated private lenders to maintain his artificial lifestyle. I inform the audience that he secured predatory bridge loans using his corporate operating accounts and his primary residence as collateral. The mention of hard money lenders causes Victoria's billionaire father to physically step away from the stage area. High society despises the scent of predatory debt. It implies poor financial hygiene and severe desperation. I look at Richard and deliver the final calculation. I state that with the master leases voided, his real estate firm holds no intrinsic value. The lenders will execute their lien rights immediately upon receiving the market alert on Monday morning. They will seize his office equipment. They will repossess his luxury vehicles. They will foreclose on his Highland Park home. He will have nowhere to live and no vehicle to drive. I tell him his business is officially dissolved. He is bankrupt. His remaining assets will be seized to repay the 6 months of arrears he owes my company. The execution is methodical and inescapable. I strip him of his fake crown in front of the exact people he invited to witness his triumph. He traded his daughter's future to buy a temporary illusion of success. He sacrificed his integrity for a handful of prestige. The illusion just evaporated, leaving him with nothing but a shattered reputation and a mountain of unpayable debt. High as a king without a kingdom, staring at the peasant who just bought his castle. The ballroom is a vacuum of stunned silence. The regional developers process the raw efficiency of the takedown. They recognize a ruthless corporate operator standing on the stage, and they realize the Morgan Empire is under new, uncompromising management. Richard sits broken in his chair, unable to formulate a defense against documented facts. But desperate ecosystems always breed frantic reactions. The silence is broken by the sound of a chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Preston steps forward. The golden child sees his father collapsing and realizes the offshore bankroll funding his fake software venture is attached to the same dying host. Preston prepares to intervene, setting the stage for his own catastrophic blunder. The ballroom remains trapped in a stagnant silence following the collapse of my father. The regional developers and the banking executives process the raw efficiency of the legal execution. They recognize an unyielding corporate operator standing on the wooden stage, and they realize the Morgan Empire is under new, uncompromising management. Richard sits broken in his velvet chair, unable to formulate a single word of defense against the documented facts. The ecosystem of their deception is shattered, but desperate environments always breed frantic, uncalculated reactions. The quiet is broken by the harsh sound of wood scraping heavily against the hardwood floor. Preston pushes his chair back from the front table. The golden child sees his father crumbling and realizes the financial umbrella shielding his fake software venture is attached to the same dying host. For his entire life, Preston operated under a distinct and permanent safety net. When he failed a university economics exam, Patricia bullied the dean into granting him an extension. When he totaled his first luxury sports car, Richard bought him a new one the following morning. I was conditioned to believe that loud indignation could erase any consequence. He thinks he can bully reality into submission by raising his voice and taking up physical space. He marches down the center aisle. His tailored navy suit pulls tight across his shoulders. He bypasses the security officers who watch his approach with detached amusement. He ascends the wooden stairs to the stage, taking them two at a time. He steps directly into my personal space, trying to use his height and his physical presence to intimidate me. His face is flushed a dark mottled red. The veins in his neck stand out, straining against his silk collar. He breathes heavily, projecting the aura of a man who expects the world to bend to his anger. He points a manicured finger inches from my face. He raises his voice, projecting his panic across the quiet ballroom. He declares that the master estate plan is a forgery. He accuses Marcus Vance of conspiring with a jealous sibling to steal his rightful inheritance. He threatens to hire a team of ruthless litigators. He promises to tie the Morgan estate up in probate court for the next 30 years. He shouts that I will spend the rest of my life drowning in legal fees, and I will never see a single cent of the supply chain revenue. He demands that I step down from the podium and hand over the documents. He expects me to step back. He expects me to flinch or raise my hands in a defensive posture. He expects to see the same submissive sister who sat quietly at Sunday dinners while he mocked her auditing career. I do not move a single inch. I look at my brother with steady clinical detachment. I see a man whose entire identity is constructed from borrowed money and unearned confidence. I do not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I do not engage in a legal debate regarding the validity of the will. Arguing with a narcissist only validates their delusion. You defeat them by removing their oxygen. I reach into the leather graduation folio resting in my left hand. Tucked behind the embossed diploma is a single sheet of heavy stock paper. I pull the document out. I hold it up between us, creating a physical barrier between his anger and my calm. I tell Preston to lower his voice and read the page. He glares at me, his chest heaving with exertion. He snatches the paper from my hand, expecting to see a copy of the estate plan or a list of legal statutes. He looks down at the text. His eyes scan the top of the page. The anger on his face halts abruptly. It freezes into an expression of profound confusion. I speak into the microphone, ensuring the oil executives and the regional developers in the front rows hear every syllable. I inform my brother that the document he is holding is the verified financial ledger for his new software company. I explain the forensic trail to the silent room. I detail how Richard and Patricia stole my $500,000 trust fund and wired it to an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. I state that the stolen capital was then routed back into Texas to provide the initial seed funding for Preston's vanity project. Patricia bragged to the Arts District brokers about a silent private equity group backing his vision. She used the term seed funding to mask the reality of the theft. I look Preston directly in the eye. I tell him the silent private equity group was not a collection of visionary venture capitalists. The offshore shell corporation was a registered subsidiary of Morgan Supply Chains. My grandfather, Thomas, built a vast network of holding companies to manage his international freight logistics. When Richard forged the conservatorship and wired the stolen trust money offshore, he did not use a random banking entity. He used a familiar routing number he found in old family corporate files. Richard thought he was hiding the money in a dormant account. He assumed the offshore holding company was an untraceable black box. He did not realize the account belonged to the very estate he was trying to rob. By wiring the funds to that specific entity, he placed the stolen money directly back into his father's pocket. I deliver the final calculation to my brother. I tell him that because the seed funding originated from a Morgan Supply Chain subsidiary, the estate holds a controlling equity stake in his software company. As the new chief executive officer of the parent corporation, I possess full administrative authority over his venture. The silent private equity group Patricia boasted about is me. I announced that I logged into the corporate banking portal 15 minutes before the graduation ceremony began. I executed a total freeze on all his operating accounts. I tell Preston his vanity project is dead. The business does not exist anymore. He cannot authorize payroll. He cannot process vendor invoices. The imported Italian desks and the raw edge walnut conference table will be seized by creditors before the end of the month. I inform him that the commercial lease on his luxury penthouse in the Arts District is tied to the frozen accounts. He has no income to pay his rent. The property management group will lock him out of the suite by Monday morning. He threatened to hire a team of ruthless litigators to tie me up in court. I remind him that corporate defense attorneys require six-figure retainers. I tell him he has a balance of zero. He has no money to hire a lawyer. He has no resources to file a lawsuit. He cannot afford a cup of coffee, let alone a drawn-out legal battle against a logistics empire. The heavy stock paper trembles in his hands. The crisp, confident tech founder evaporates. The reality of his poverty crashes down upon him with crushing weight. He spent his 20s mocking my grueling hours in my modest apartment. He assumed he was destined for greatness while I was meant to toil in obscurity. Now he is holding the undeniable proof that he is a financial captive. Preston looks at the ledger again. He reads the routing numbers and the equity distribution clauses. The legal language is ironclad and unforgiving. He is trapped inside a cage built by his own father's incompetence. His breath hitches in his throat, producing a ragged, pathetic sound. He drops the paper. It flutters to the hardwood floor, landing near my dark shoes. He takes a step backward, retreating from the podium. The golden child is finally forced to face the brutal mechanics of the real world. Without Richard's stolen money, Preston is nothing but a man wearing a custom suit he can no longer afford. He looks toward the audience, seeking a lifeline. He scans the front row until he finds Victoria. Victoria sits at the premier table wearing her tailored white dress and her diamond pendant. She belongs to an oil dynasty that values tangible assets and verified yields. She does not marry liabilities. Preston looks at her with wide, desperate eyes. He silently begs her to intervene. He wants her father to step forward and write a check to solve his problems. He wants the oil fortune to rescue him from the consequences of his own arrogance. High society operates on a strict code of self-preservation. Wealth pardons many character flaws, but it never pardons total financial ruin. The silence in the ballroom stretches. The regional developers and the banking executives watch the exchange, calculating the fallout. The reality of Preston's poverty has already settled over the room like a thick layer of dust. He turns to his wealthy fiancée, searching for a sympathetic gaze, but he is about to discover that unconditional love is rarely found in an ecosystem built on transactional power. The final pillar of their illusion is ready to fall. Preston stands on the wooden stage holding the financial ledger. His eyes dart toward the premier table, searching for a lifeline. He locks his gaze onto Victoria. He expects the bond of their engagement to transcend the ledger I just exposed. He fails to realize that high society marriages are rarely built on unconditional devotion. They are corporate mergers designed to consolidate power and protect existing assets. His side of the ledger just went into permanent receivership. Sitting next to Victoria is her father, William Beaumont. William is a man who constructed a generational oil fortune through ruthless pragmatism. He spent his youth negotiating drilling rights and evaluating seismic data. He survived the brutal boom and bust cycles of the Texas energy sector by recognizing toxic investments long before they collapsed. He does not gamble on dry wells. He watches the exchange on the stage with eyes like chipped flint. He processes the forged conservatorship, the stolen inheritance, and the frozen operating accounts. He calculates the blast radius of my father's fraud and arrives at a definitive conclusion. William does not yell. He does not demand an explanation from Richard or Preston. In his specific tier of wealth, you do not argue with a fraud. You simply sever the connection. He stands up from his chair. The movement is slow and deliberate, drawing the immediate attention of the surrounding tables. He buttons his suit jacket. He looks at Richard with a gaze devoid of pity. It is a look of unfiltered disgust. He recognizes a sinking ship, and he refuses to let his daughter drown in the undertow. William reaches down and places his hand on Victoria's shoulder. It is a silent, nonverbal command. Victoria is a product of her environment. She was raised to protect the family name at all costs. She evaluates her future husband not with the compassion of a bride, but with the cold calculation of an auditor. She looks at Preston standing near the podium holding a worthless piece of paper. She sees a man who possesses no capital, no company, and no integrity. She realizes the luxury penthouse and the bespoke suits were purchased with stolen money. She understands that marrying him means attaching her pristine social standing to a federal wire fraud investigation. Victoria stands up. She smooths the fabric of her tailored white dress. Preston watches her, his chest heaving with exertion. He opens his mouth to formulate a desperate excuse, but she raises a single manicured hand, stopping him cold. She does not offer a word of comfort. She does not offer a private conversation to discuss their relationship. She reaches for her left hand. Her fingers grasp the 3-carat diamond engagement ring. Preston purchased that stone using the artificial credit lines generated by his offshore shell corporation. It is a symbol of their union, forged entirely from my stolen inheritance. Victoria slides the heavy platinum band off her finger. She turns toward a nearby cocktail table. She drops the ring onto the polished glass surface. The jewelry lands with a sharp metallic clink that echoes across the silent ballroom. She does not look back at Preston. She does not look at Richard or Patricia. She takes her father's arm and walks down the center aisle toward the heavy wooden doors. Her posture is rigid and unbothered. She is discarding a bad asset. William escorts her out of the banquet hall, leaving my brother standing on the stage alone, staring at the discarded diamond. The departure of the Beaumont family serves as a starting pistol for the remaining guests. The Dallas elite operate on a strict code of self-preservation. They attend these receptions to network and secure lucrative contracts. They do not attend to serve as character witnesses in a criminal indictment. The realization that Richard Morgan is a bankrupt thief initiates a rapid, coordinated exodus. Chairs scrape against the hardwood floor in unison. The regional developers and the banking executives stand up, gathering their wives and their personal belongings. Nobody approaches the stage to offer condolences. Nobody stops at the dessert station to sample the catered pastries. The room devolves into a quiet, frantic stampede toward the exits. Men who were shaking Richard's hand 20 minutes ago pull their cell phones from their pockets, immediately dialing their own legal counsel to sever any pending deals with his real estate firm. They erase his phone number from their contacts before they even reach the lobby. They treat the Morgan family like a financial contagion. The caterers freeze against the walls, holding silver trays of untouched caviar and vintage champagne. They watch the wealthiest citizens in the city flee the ballroom as if the building is on fire. In less than 3 minutes, the sprawling venue transforms into a ghost town. The air is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the distinct bitter tang of social ruin. Patricia remains near the shattered glass of her dropped champagne flute. She watches her carefully curated universe evaporate in front of her eyes. She spent the last 30 years evaluating human worth based on zip codes and country club invitations. She structured her entire identity around the approval of the women who just walked past her without offering a single glance. Her social currency is gone. She is a pariah. Her legs give out. She sinks heavily into a nearby velvet chair. Her bright floral silk dress bunches around her knees. She brings her trembling hands up to cover her face. A loud, ragged sob tears through her throat. She weeps openly in the empty ballroom, mourning the death of her status. She cries for the luxury vehicles that will be repossessed and the Highland Park mansion that will be foreclosed upon by the shadow lenders. She expects a sympathetic ear, but there is no one left to listen. She sacrificed her only loyal daughter to build a kingdom of lies, and now she must occupy the ruins alone. Richard is still trapped in his chair near the edge of the stage. The arrogant patriarch is gone. He stares at the hardwood floor unblinking. His mind cannot process the sheer speed of his destruction. He woke up this morning believing he was a respected executive on the verge of securing a billionaire-in-law. He thought his hidden debts were safely concealed beneath layers of performative wealth. He thought he outsmarted my grandfather and marginalized my existence. Now he faces the brutal mechanics of his new reality. His commercial real estate firm is dissolved. His warehouse leases are terminated. The shadow lenders will seize his remaining personal assets by dawn. His son is exposed as a fraudulent failure, and his wife is sobbing in the corner of a deserted reception hall. He traded his integrity for a temporary illusion, and the illusion just shattered, leaving him with an unpayable deficit. I stand at the podium looking down at the architects of my suffering. I do not feel pity. I do not feel a triumphant surge of joy. I feel the cold, objective satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. The debt they incurred by stealing my trust fund has been settled with crushing interest. I gather my master degree and the bound estate plan. I step off the wooden platform and walk down the center aisle. I leave them sitting in the quiet wreckage of their own greed. The war is over. The transition of power is complete. Now I must assume control of the empire they tried to steal from me. 7 days pass since the ballroom emptied. The transition of power requires a precise and methodical sequence of events. Marcus Vance finalized the transfer paperwork on Monday morning, handing me the physical access credentials to my new life. I drive my used sedan into the private underground parking structure of the Morgan Supply Chain's headquarters. The building is a monolith of steel and tinted glass situated in the center of the Dallas commercial district. I bypass the visitor lobby and take the private elevator to the top floor. The heavy steel doors slide open to reveal the executive suite. The environment is a sanctuary of functional design. There are no imported Italian leather sofas or artisan bourbon bars here. The walls are lined with glowing digital monitors tracking freight routes across the southern states. The air is quiet and perfectly still. The chaotic noise of my former family has been permanently muted. I walk across the dark carpet and stand before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view overlooks the sprawling Dallas logistics hubs. I watch the fleet of refrigerated transport trucks moving along the interstate. They look like white blood cells pumping through the arteries of a healthy organism. This is the empire my grandfather built. It is a fortress of tangible yields and verified labor. I step away from the glass and approach the center of the room. A heavy oak desk dominates the space. It belonged to Thomas Morgan. I take a seat in his leather chair. It feels firm and unyielding. I open the daily operational reports resting on the polished wood. The ledgers reflect a company operating at peak efficiency. The numbers are clean and devoid of deception. The financial executions I authorized last Saturday proceeded with the cold efficiency of a corporate audit. When the county court opened on Monday morning, the shadow lenders did not hesitate. They received the automated alerts regarding the termination of my father's master warehouse leases. The lenders recognized that Richard possessed zero incoming revenue. They triggered the default clauses on his predatory bridge loans. The seizure of assets was swift and entirely legal. Tow trucks arrived at the Highland Park estate before noon to repossess the luxury vehicles. Foreclosure notices were posted on the front door of the mansion. Richard and Patricia were granted 72 hours to vacate the premises. They are currently moving their remaining personal belongings into a cheap rental apartment located on the industrial outskirts of the city. Patricia can no longer host charity luncheons or curate exclusive guest lists. She shares a thin wall with transient tenants and listens to the sound of freight trains rattling the foundation of her building. The air in her new neighborhood smells of diesel fuel and hot asphalt. She evaluates her new neighbors and realizes she possesses no social currency to manipulate them. She spends her afternoons trying to clean scuff marks off her few remaining designer handbags. Richard spends his days sitting in a small laminate kitchen trying to negotiate payment plans with secondary creditors who refuse to return his phone calls. His posture is permanently slumped, carrying the physical weight of his ruined reputation. The men who drank his vintage champagne will no longer acknowledge his existence. They sacrificed their integrity to build a kingdom of lies, and the kingdom crumbled, leaving them stranded in a desert of their own making. They traded my secure future for a temporary illusion, and now they must live with the permanent deficit. The golden child experienced a similar introduction to the brutal mechanics of the real world. When I froze the offshore shell corporation funding his fake software venture, Preston lost his entire identity. The property management group overseeing his luxury penthouse in the Arts District locked him out of the suite on Tuesday. His bespoke suits and imported furniture were seized to cover the broken lease agreement. Victoria blocked his number and boarded a private flight to Europe, erasing him from her digital history. Preston possesses no academic degrees and zero verifiable skills. He spent his 20s mocking the concept of a rigid schedule and a standard paycheck. He assumed he was a visionary exempt from the daily grind. Now he is drowning in crushing personal debts. He was forced to accept the only employment he could secure without a reference or a specialized resume. He currently works a data entry job for a regional insurance provider. Because his luxury car was repossessed, he rides the city bus for an hour each morning to reach a sprawling gray office park. He sits in a fabric cubicle under harsh fluorescent lights. He stares at a monitor for 9 hours a day, typing claim numbers into a database for minimum wage. His hands cramp from the unfamiliar repetition. He is mandated to wear a standard uniform polo shirt that scratches his neck. He receives a 30-minute lunch break, and his supervisor monitors his keystrokes to ensure productivity. The universe corrected his unearned arrogance by forcing him to perform the exact type of grueling repetitive labor he always believed was beneath him. He is learning the true cost of $1 agonizing keystroke at a time. He looks at spreadsheets all day, but none of the numbers belong to him. I sit behind the heavy oak desk and review the freight manifests for the upcoming quarter. I feel no guilt. Society conditions us to believe that shared genetics require infinite forgiveness. We are taught to absorb the mistreatment and compromise our own boundaries to keep the family unit intact. We are instructed to pour our resources into toxic environments because blood ties are supposedly sacred. In the corporate auditing sector, you learn a very different philosophy. You learn that a failing system must be dismantled to protect the healthy assets. You do not pour clean capital into a bankrupt venture. You cut your losses and you isolate the liability. Emotional debts operate under the exact same framework as financial debts. The same logic applies to blood relations. Genetics do not entitle anyone to your peace or your property. When people show you they are willing to burn your future to warm themselves, you must have the courage to walk away and let them freeze. My parents and my brother treated my existence as a utility. They tried to consume my secure future to sustain their own illusions of grandeur. I allowed them to build their trap, and then I locked them inside it. I close the operational reports and look out the window at the setting Texas sun. The sky turns a deep, bruised purple over the industrial skyline. The legacy of the Morgan family no longer relies on deception or shadow loans. My legacy begins today entirely on my own terms. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you agree that boundaries are stronger than blood. I sit behind the heavy oak desk of my grandfather, listening to the quiet hum of the logistics empire. The sun dips below the Dallas skyline, painting the concrete freight yards in shades of amber and slate. The war is over, the ledgers are balanced. My parents are navigating the grim reality of a cheap industrial apartment, and my brother is tethered to a minimum wage data entry terminal. They traded my future to fund a temporary illusion, and the universe handed them the permanent deficit they earned. Looking back at the wreckage of their greed, I recognize the exact mechanics of my survival. Surviving a toxic family requires more than just endurance. It requires a fundamental shift in philosophy. I learned 5 distinct lessons during this audit that redefined my understanding of human behavior. First, blood does not equal loyalty. Society conditions us to tolerate abuse from relatives under the guise of family duty. But genetics do not entitle anyone to your peace or your property. Firm boundaries are the only true foundation of a healthy life. When people demand you set yourself on fire to keep them warm, you must walk away and let them freeze. Second, financial literacy is the ultimate armor against exploitation. Understanding the language of money protects you from manipulation. My parents tried to use a forged legal document to erase my existence because they assumed I was naive. Knowing how to read a balance sheet and track a commercial wire transfer gave me the leverage to dismantle their entire operation. Third, the illusion of wealth is almost always funded by raw desperation. People who possess true capital do not need to flaunt bespoke suits or host lavish rehearsal dinners. The loudest voices in the room are usually hiding the deepest debts. True power is silent, verified, and built on tangible assets rather than hollow social climbing. Fourth, never confront a fraud without securing the ledger. If I had yelled at my parents, "I found my bank account empty," they would have hidden the evidence and shifted the blame. Silence is a supreme tactical advantage. It lulls the arrogant into a false sense of security, allowing you to gather the undeniable proof required to execute a flawless, unrecoverable strike. Fifth, you cannot save a failing system by pouring clean capital into it. Whether you are dealing with a bankrupt commercial real estate firm or a highly toxic relationship, the solution remains the same. You must isolate the liability and cut your losses. My grandfather knew he could not cure my father's greed, so he built a trap to amputate the infection and protect the healthy corporate body. I close the daily operational reports and turn off the brass desk lamp. The executive office goes dark, but the refrigerated freight trucks on the highway below keep moving, keeping the supply chain alive. I am the sole architect of my future now. I hold the keys to an empire built on verified labor and unyielding truth. The Morgan legacy belongs to me, and I will govern it entirely on my own terms, without a single apology. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you found strength in these lessons and believe that protecting your peace is a basic human right, please hit the like button and subscribe to Senior Echo Stories. Stay vigilant, guard your boundaries, and I will see you in the next narrative.